Thank you very much for coming and listening to this talk. I hope it's going to be fun and hopefully it's going to be interesting for you. Um, Before I start talking properly, I usually do this at the end, at the start of my talks these days, because I often forget at the end. If you have any questions or queries or anything like that after the talk, usually it takes me a good 24 hours to think of a question. There's my email address, and there's all my various handles for social media and things like that down there. And there's a Facebook discussion group, which is actually, if you actually do want to get a discussion going and seeing what people remember, or if people have cooked the same dish as you, for example, there's lots of chat on there. So I would encourage you, if you use Facebook, to join the group. There's going to be an episode of the podcast coming out about puddings, hopefully on Friday as well, by the way. And it's a very large subject. And although I have, of course, written the philosophy of puddings, there's so much stuff that even in today's talk, I'm only going to really scratch the surface. It's a really large topic. So I would encourage you also to go to the blog britishfoodhistory.com, because this isn't a recipe book and there's loads of recipes on the website if you want to go and have a look at it. Absolutely loads. Christmas puddings, all sorts of puddings that I haven't even included in this book because it's a huge subject. Anybody who knows their puddings will know this. When we think about puddings, and if anybody are outside the UK scratching your head thinking, what is a pudding? Don't worry, I'm going to get onto that in a minute. But I very much put some pictures of some puddings that I've made, which I think of as sort of quintessential British puds. We've got a treacle sponge pudding there. We've got a jam roly-poly. This is a steamed type of plum pudding called a hunting pudding. The recipe for that one actually isn't on my blog, but it's in the back of my biography of Elizabeth Raffles before Mrs. Beeton. And here is a kind of set pudding called a carrageen pudding, where it's not set with gelatin, but it's set with the seaweed carrageen, also known as Irish moss. And yeah, this is just a small subset of the puddings. But when I think of puddings, these are the kind of things that I'm talking about. But as we're about to find out, it gets a little bit more complicated. So, yes, I was very lucky that I don't know if you've seen the philosophy of dot 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 series that the British Library do, but just let a few more people in. There we go. Yeah, they do this amazing set of books. And again, if you've listened to the podcast, I've spoken to Sam Bilton because she did one about chocolate. I spoke to Sejal Sukadwala talking about curry. And I was very happy that when I made my suggestion to do puddings, the British Library accepted. It was such good fun to write. Like I said, it is a massive topic. And my other book that I've been talking about recently, Need to Know, of course, that's all about baking. Now, most puddings even are not baked, but some are. So there's also quite a lot about puddings in Need to Know. And there was no repetition of material in either book. Like I say, it's a very big topic. I'm going to be talking almost entirely about the research in this book, but there's a little bit from Need to Know. If you're interested in getting a signed copy, by the way, and if you're in the UK, it's not too late to order one from me. I've had quite a few orders, but if somebody doesn't want to email me today or tomorrow, I can get some packed up and sent off, signed and sent off for you. So do get in contact and ask me about that. But anyway, let's get cracking properly. So here is the big question. What is a pudding? Now, if you're British, you're probably going, everybody knows what pudding is because it's very much part of our food culture. But if you're outside of the country, then it's rather confusing. And when I moved to America, this is ages ago now, I was still in the sciences before I'd become a sort of full-time food historian, in fact, quite a while before that. that my work colleagues and my friends very much loved coming round and I'd cook them jam roly polies and sticky toffee puddings, but they just always asked because they were so confused, what is a pudding? It seems to be so many different things. I've got up here on the screen a little image taken from an edition of Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management with some nice fancy sort of set desserts and charlottes and jellies and trifles and that sort of thing. When we think about puddings, though, what I would say is an important one anyway is Christmas pudding. It's Dickensian. It's that round cannonball shaped thing. It's it's looking at the comics and things I used to read as a kid, like the Dandy and the Beano. There'd always be plum duffs and plum puddings, that round shape. Even though most of us probably haven't had one of those ones, it's a very familiar image that we have in our food culture. Very Victorian. There's jam roly poly, treacle sponge, like I was just mentioning before, sticky toffee pudding, which is extremely popular, probably the most popular pudding. That one's baked, so they're not all boiled or steamed, of course. But then when you think about it a little bit more, you go, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, I've just mentioned all of those desserts, essentially, but there's a steak and kidney pudding, which is basically a stew wrapped in suet pastry and boiled or steamed. But then there's also trifle. So how is that? How on earth is that a pudding? And then you got things like black pudding, aka blood sausage, outside of the UK. How can a trifle and black pudding, and things like haggis all be puddings? It's absolutely crazy. Angel delight, that whipped dessert that's sort of quite similar to the American sort of banana pudding, sort of creamy swirl in a glass. But then you've got peas pudding, which is essentially mushed up split peas boiled in a bag, cooked alongside some ham. And then there's even Viennetta, which last time I gave a talk about this, I said modern, and I don't think Viennetta is modern anymore. It's probably considered pretty retro. But in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty modern from a historical point of view. And of course, there's Yorkshire pudding. Being from Yorkshire, I've got to mention that, haven't I, in the list? And it's very different to everything else on those list of foods I've just talked about. And then there's something like apple pie, which has been eaten for centuries, of course, but has only relatively recent been considered a pudding because, of course, it's not boiled, it's not steamed, it's not put in a mold, it's baked and it's in a double layer of pastry. So the question is, how on earth can all of these things be pudding? Add another layer of complication. It also means, depending where you are in the country, any dessert or afters is also called pudding. So that's just the kind of the final straw. So mind-blowing. And what I realized was, when it came to writing the book, because it's not a very long book, so I had to pack a lot of information in there. And I also had to be very choosy about what things I talked about and what things I didn't include. And what I realized was, this has to be the story of the word pudding. Usually words evolve through the centuries and change. But in the case of a pudding, it's a bit of a special, strange case because the word pudding has stayed the same, even though the foods, which all come from a sort of an origin point, have branched out to become this huge, sprawling, extremely diverse types of food, but they've all retained the name pudding, and they all still exist now. So a black pudding still exists, and it couldn't be more different from a trifle, but they're somehow both puddings. So that's how I decided to approach the book, really. So if we're going to go right back to the beginning, what we need to do, I would say, is look, well, if you want recipes, in Britain, we can go as far back as the Middle Ages. The earliest recipes are Roman, 4th century, but they've been eaten certainly since antiquity. A type of black pudding made from goat's blood with chopped up fat and cooked in a goat's stomach is described in Homer's Odyssey, for example. But when it comes to the bulk of the early recipes, not entirely all of the early recipes, it's black pudding that we're talking about that's made from blood. And I've got a picture here. This isn't a medieval picture, it's actually a tapestry, and it's early modern, but things have not changed much in the few centuries spanning the Middle Ages to the early modern sort of 17th century. And what we've got here is a very sort of typical rural scene of a poor old pig being stuck in the throat. In the background, like you can see a pig that's already been killed and they're scraping all the sort of wiry hair off it, ready for butchering. But as you can see, there's a rather capable woman here. And I say capable woman because the great folklorist, food historian Dorothy Hartley wrote about black puddings in the Middle Ages. And this is what she wrote. The house pig was usually slaughtered near the house, and a capable woman attended to catch the blood as it spurted out after the pig had been stuck. This is from one of her lesser known books called Lost Country Life, which very much focuses on the sort of that cusp between late medieval and early modern times. It's really good. If you can get hold of it, it's really, really good. It's out of print now, unfortunately. Not just pigs were used, all sorts of animal blood, so pigs, sheep, geese. I did find one example of a black pudding made out of chicken blood. What's going on there? Sorry, there's a close-up of the capable woman. Puddings and guts were even eaten during Lent, which doesn't really make sense because during Lent and other times of fasting, you didn't eat any meat. At least fish were allowed, but anything else you couldn't eat. And there was also no other animal products allowed either. So it caused problems, except, of course, people also ate things like seals, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And I did find a 15th century recipe for the pudding of a porpoise, porpoise black pudding. The blood and the fat, I suppose, or blubber, I suppose you would say, were taken mixed together with oatmeal, salt, black pepper, and ginger, stuffed into the gut of the porpoise, and then boiled. So even on fast days, the upper classes are eating luxuriantly. And for a good chunk of history, British history anyway, the porpoise was automatically, if it's washed up on the shore, automatically belonged to the king or to the crown. So extremely posh food. And yeah, I mean, obviously a mammal, not really a fish. And I'm pretty sure that they knew it wasn't really a fish at the time. I just think they were just wanting to bend the rules. That's what I suspect anyway. There were also cooks, women called pudding wives, who were hired by large houses, so often monasteries, to go in and prepare the puddings. The young King Henry VIII had a pudding wife. He employed a pudding wife at Hampton Court Palace. And it sounds like quite a nice job, kind of rosy cheeked, making all these nice steamed and boiled puddings. But in fact, it was actually a horrible, grueling, smelly work because the pudding wife was coming in to clean out all the intestines, of all the partially digested food and the feces, and cleaning it all out, scrubbing it, chopping up the various offal or the blood and things like that, and stuffing it into the intestines, fastening it at both ends, and boiling it in a pot. And she would stand over the boiling pot with a pudding prick, ready to pop any air bubbles that might appear. Because if you took your eye off the ball, there's a good chance your pudding would explode. There were, surprisingly, quite sweet. So you look at these recipes, especially when you start to get into the Tudors and the Stuarts, your black puddings have lots of cream, eggs, sugar, dried fruit. And there's one example of a very sweet pudding in Elizabeth Cromwell's cookery book. Elizabeth Cromwell being the wife of Oliver Cromwell. She actually produced a cookery book, and she has a really delicious but very rich sounding breakfast pudding, which is made out of ground almonds and bone marrow, and it's flavored with musk and ambergris and things like that. So, maybe not something you would expect from somebody who was eating something from guts. And what I found was, you might be surprised at this, is that things like rice pudding and bread puddings, like bread and butter puddings, or the variations thereon, all have their origins in these puddings boiled in guts. So it wasn't all blood and weird offal. There was some stuff that we would recognize as perfectly fine food. Now it's just we wouldn't cook it in an intestine, we'd cook it in some other fashion. That said, we were gung ho when it came to our offal. There's a few from the early modern period that I'm just going to mention, just so you can kind of get an idea of what some of the strange things were going into puddings at this this period of history. Robert May, 1660, the accomplished cook. I use his cookbooks in my talks a lot, and I didn't want to leave him out. He's got puddings made out of heifer's udder. Hannah Glass, in the 18th century, she has a pudding made from the pith of an ox, in other words, spinal cord. Sir Kenelm Digby, 17th century, he was a founding member of the Royal Society, I believe, and he's got my favorite weird offally recipe. I'm going to read out a little section of it. Here's a recipe for an excellent pudding. That's what he calls it. And he instructs us to take of the tripes of veal the whitest and finest you can find, wash them well, and let them lie in fair fountain or river water till they do not smell like tripes, which I think is probably pretty good advice. Oh, I forgot to put the picture of a medieval porpoise on there. But really, what I want to do is spend most of the time of this talk really talking about the golden age of puddings, what I consider to be the golden age of puddings. And that's the Tudors and Stuarts, but especially the Georgians and the Victorians. In the early 17th century, so we're talking 1620s, you start to see recipes for puddings where guts are not used anymore, and instead a cloth is being used to tie up the ingredients and to just boil it up, a pudding cloth. Now, I've got a feeling they might have been used a little bit before then, but it takes a while for these things to catch on and to appear in printed cookery books. So I think the pudding cloth in reality maybe just about exists at the end of the Elizabethan period, but it really catches on by the time you get to the Stuart dynasty getting into full flow. Not that long afterwards, you find people are already adapting, and they are using things like butter boxes, which often have really beautiful carvings on. They're using those to put their puddings in, then tying it in a cloth and boiling it. And then when you tip into the Georgian period, into the 18th century, you see descriptions of people making puddings in little porcelain cups, china cups, which, sorry, what was I saying? Yes, they must have really been on edge whilst these very expensive bits of china were clattering around. Very quickly, people like Wedgwood and other producers of porcelain, in Staffordshire and various places around the Midlands of England, jumped on this and started making their own versions much more cheaply with cheaper porcelain, simply glazed, and people very quickly then moved on to using molds rather than bags in the majority. But again, like I said at the beginning, none of these things completely died out. So people were using molds and cloths and intestines. But what you found was with these molds and cloths, there was a separation of meat from pudding because it used to be you could only make a pudding if you had a bit of intestine. So that made them usually meaty and usually full of offal, because that's the other thing that you've got in absolute bucket loads, literally, if you're slaughtering animals. So they always went together, but now they were separate. So what you found was puddings lost their meat essentially in the main. They became sweeter, but they were still not for dessert, but they'd have things like expensive sugar, spices, dried fruits, because they were fancy and people wanted to show off. These early puddings that are made in cloths and molds, your working classes were not eating them. This is the food of, people who were pretty well off. And when you get to the Georgian period, the most popular pudding, in fact, it was certainly the national dish, the plum pudding. It had evolved from plum pottage, which was things like dried fruit and sugar, breadcrumbs, booze, and beef, mixed together, very, very thick, and you'd eat it with a spoon. When we moved to cloths, the meat was removed, taken out, because there wasn't necessarily going to be meat around, and it was made into a pudding. People still liked their beef, and instead what they had, instead of beef mixed into it, they had alongside it, usually anyway, roast beef. And in the Georgian period, there was a burgeoning British Empire, but there'd also been an agricultural revolution where we'd worked out how to grow food all year round, feed our animals all year round. We grew the carcasses of our animals by selective breeding. It really changed things a huge amount. Food had never been so plentiful, if you could afford it, that is. I mean, there's a big disparity between rich and poor. But you had this beef, which very much exemplified just how great the British were. We'd managed to tame nature. And then you also had this pudding, which is quintessentially British. Nobody outside of the UK, well, out of Britain, should I say? That would be anachronous to say the UK. Outside of Great Britain, nobody knew what plum pudding was. It was completely bizarre. So very, very British, but made from the ingredients collected from the growing empire. Sugar made by slaves, various spices, dried fruits, candied peels made from exotic citrus fruits, all those kind of things. So it really exemplified just how great we were. There's a lot of hubris going around in the 18th and 19th centuries, that's for sure. But as these things became cheaper, it also meant that everybody could eat it. And of course, there was always aspiration anyway, sort of tugging this sort of food of the rich, to make, there's always pressure to make it a bit cheaper, so more and more people could afford it. And we get to the point, of course, where plum pudding, or there's a variety of plum pudding, becomes Christmas pudding. And I've got here a quote for you from A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens. It's a very famous scene. The Cratchits are having their Christmas dinner. This is what Dickens says. "Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper, a smell like washing day. That was the cloth, a smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and bedight with Christmas holly stuck on top." Which is a fantastic description. If anybody has made a pudding at home, like this in a cloth, I mean, you will agree with me that Dickens absolutely nails that. It's extremely evocative. It's a fantastic little bit of writing. Now, it is surely no coincidence that 2 years after A Christmas Carol, his bestseller is published, that you find recipes for not just plum pudding, but Christmas pudding. Plum pudding's been eaten all year round. People wanted an extra special version one round Christmas. And I don't think it's a coincidence, the publication of Dickens' book and the fact that 2 years later recipes begin to appear. But they're not hugely different. You know, it's an extra couple of handfuls of dried fruit, a glug or two extra of booze. There's not a massive difference. Here's another quote that I found from the Illustrated London News. So from 1850, so only 7 years after Dickens' book. And it says, whilst the 12th cake, now the 12th cake was a kind of fruit cake covered in royal icing. While the 12th cake is more an aristocratic type, the plum pudding is a national symbol. It does not represent a class or caste, but the bulk of the English nation. There is not a man, woman, or child raised above what the French would call prolétaire that does not expect a taste of plum pudding of some sort or another on Christmas Day. And it's true, it become instilled into the fabric of, well, not just the English, but I would say the British food, its constitution. And even if you were in a workhouse, you'd be expecting to get some roast beef and plum pudding on Christmas Day. It was just one of those things. Everybody had to have it. Oh yeah, by the way, at the same time, things like jellies and ice cream start to be included in this definition of a pudding. Now, jellies had to be made laboriously by extracting the gelatin from calves' feet, making ices like sorbets and ice creams. This is before refrigeration and freezing. They were extremely expensive. So again, this is not, jelly and ice cream was not for kids' parties, that's for sure. But because you could set the jellies or shape the ices in pudding molds, they kind of became honorary puddings and were accepted under the ever increasingly large sort of umbrella term that is pudding. What I'd like to quickly talk about is one phrase, because this is something that really stumped me. And I'd had some assumptions about what the answer to this was, and it turned out I was actually pretty wrong. And that's the phrase, what's for pudding? When people ask what is for pudding in the UK, they mean what is for dessert. Is a catch-all term. Where did this arise? I wanted to make sure that all the sort of connections of all the different meanings of puddings were included in the book. So I would be really sad if I couldn't find a link. And luckily I did find it. I was very pleased that I did. And the reason that all desserts ended up being called pudding, not just so it's confusing for people that live outside of the British Isles, but it's because we changed the way in which we eat. And that's really the butterfly flapping its wings and causing all these different effects down the road. It used to be that we ate, so the beginning of the Georgian period, in fact, the whole of the Georgian period, service à la Française, where all the food that you're eating on a table, like this example here from Elizabeth Raffald's book, all the foods are laid out on the table. So you sit down and you choose whatever you want. You might pass the plates around. It's a really nice social occasion, I think. But then we changed in the Victorian period. Not everyone changed at once. It was quite a slow change. We changed to service à la Russe, where you have not all the food on the table, but separate different courses, as we've got here in this 1907 menu here, where things have definitely changed by the time you get to the 20th century. But what it did was it started to pull the meal apart. So whilst before people used to like mixing quite sweet things with savory things, like the plum pudding and the roast beef, suddenly what you had to do was separate everything out into courses. So after a while, I mean, there was a bit of confusion at first, but after a while, what you got was the soup and the fish at the beginning. Then you get the sort of roasts and the stews and the heavier things like that. And then you'd end up going to lighter vegetables, and then sweet-ish things, which as a category the puddings certainly fit into, and then to very sweet things that was traditionally eaten for dessert. So, for example, on this menu, it's things like champagne jelly and things like that, really sweet stuff. But as you can see from this menu, is it has successfully pulled it apart. Look, because we've got our roast ribs of beef and roast sirloin, and then right down here we do have the plum pudding, but it's being served with brandy sauce. Certainly not being served with the beef. So that's our setup. So that doesn't explain why every dessert's called what's for pudding. But what you found was when you're not having a big fancy dinner, like I've shown on those two menus, if it's I don't know, Wednesday lunchtime or a Tuesday evening, okay, people still wanted something for their dessert, but you're only going to get one or two options. And being such lovers of puddings, what we asked for were things like jam roly-poly, plum pudding, treacle tart, all that kind of stuff. And again, we're not talking about your working class or middle class people. This is the upper classes that we're talking about here. Given the choice, you've even got one or two things you can go for. We invariably went for a pudding. This suited the kitchen because they were cheap to make and they were easy to make. You could just pop one onto boil or steam for a few hours and you could forget about it. So it suited everyone, I suppose. So what you found was when it came to a midweek lunch or midweek evening meal, there'd be one or two puddings for dessert. So very quickly, what's for dessert became what's for pudding, and it kind of stuck. And again, the aspirational British, when the middle classes noticed the upper classes were calling their dessert pudding, they called theirs pudding too, and so it began to trickle down society. But what I really like about puddings is that they're okay. There are ones that are expensive. There certainly were ones in the past that were expensive that certainly working class or lower middle class people would be able to afford. In the main, puddings are really very simple. And they're made with a very limited palette of ingredients. So in the main, things like bread, so whether that's sliced bread or whether it's breadcrumbs or torn up pieces of bread, great way of using up leftovers. People were much more thrifty than we are today. The main fat is suet, so it's the compacted fat found around the kidneys of, well, all mammals actually, but we typically use beef suet because it doesn't have a pronounced flavor, but it does provide richness. But unlike butter, it doesn't have a strong flavor itself. Of course, there's some kind of flour, usually plain flour, but with the baked puddings as self-raising flour, that there is not always, but sometimes egg and dairy. Not too much egg. There is that phrase, I don't know over egg the pudding. You don't want to make it too rich. Puddings are meant to be really quite plain, as in the old-fashioned plain food of Britain, of England, of Scotland, where there's just not many ingredients, but they're just cooked very well. And then when it comes to sweetness, if indeed this is a sweet pudding we're talking about, yes, sugar is used, but often it's things like jam or dried fruits, especially currants, treacle, golden syrup as well, used quite a lot. They're usually quite low sweetness. But what's very important is that you use ingredients that are of good quality. If you've only got a handful of different ingredients in there, then you've got to make sure that they're good. So yes, puddings are basic from the point of view of the ingredients list, and they're fairly basic when it comes to actually making one and steaming them. They're actually fairly easy, but you can't take any shortcuts, which leads me on to a tale, something that I found that from the book, which I entitled Death by Bread Pudding. And I thought I would share it with you. This is what I found out because I was pretty agog at this. So I thought I'd let you, I thought I'd pass it on to you as a word of warning. Death by bread pudding. Making delicious sticks to your ribs puddings from leftover bread makes for excellent home economics, but the ingredients must still be of excellent quality. Unfortunately, there was one incident where the ingredients certainly were not, and it led to the death of two people, including a child. According to a report written in the 1878 edition of the Pharmaceutical Journal by Dr. Alfred H. Allen of the Sheffield School of Medicine, it is a sorry tale indeed. The incident occurred in a cafe and bakery in Barnsley, owned by a Mr. Thresh, who had been accumulating scraps of leftover bread for a bread pudding. Nothing wrong with that, of course, except he'd been sequestering them for a full week, and some of the bread had been picked from half-eaten ham sandwiches. All who ate his pudding fell violently ill, and a waiter and Thresh's own 3-year-old son died. Dr. Allen found that the bread was very mouldy and concluded that the mould was the notorious ergot fungus. Symptoms of ergot poisoning include vomiting, seizures, mania, and psychosis. We don't know what happened to Mr. Thresh or his cafe cum bakery. That the sorry incident happened is, of course, tragic, but it is one of many, I am sure, which fuel the argument that puddings and other foods made from leftovers are inferior, which they definitely are not. Shockingly, 1/3 of all bread baked in the United Kingdom is thrown away, a travesty. Just think of the scores or thousands of wonderful, satisfying puddings that were never cooked. If you make just one pudding after reading this book or listening to this talk, please let it be a bread pudding. I mean, they are fantastic things. I think bread and butter pudding is probably my favorite of the bread puddings, but I'm not turning any down. There's the ergot fungus, which some people say caused the mania surrounding the Salem witch trials, because the ergot fungus usually, or most commonly, is found on rye. So people who eat a lot of rye bread sometimes succumb to the poisoning from the ergot fungus. But it's odd how you get so many puddings, well over 1,000 different puddings, from the British Isles. And they all end up with their own names. They're often attached to specific places or people. And I thought I'd just have a little look at this because it's one thing that really amused me. Now, I live in Manchester these days, despite being from Yorkshire. And I don't know if you've ever eaten a Manchester pudding and whether you've heard of a Manchester pudding. It's pretty straightforward. It's a baked variety of pudding, and it's essentially a puff pastry case. There's a set custard inside, and it's set with eggs, of course, but also some breadcrumbs. So it's a little more stable than a usual set custard. Before you put the custard in, though, you spread it with a little bit of jam. So it's very simple. It's quite sweet, but it really is a delicious pudding. Now, the first time that appears, or I could find it anyway in a book, is 1859. How about, this is one that you possibly have heard of, Queen of Puddings, and it's quite similar. It's got the same set custard, but the custard is just poured straight into a dish. It's not in pastry. You set it in the oven. You very carefully put a layer of jam on top, then some meringue, and then pop it back in the oven so the meringue browns. Now, the first time that appears is 1865, 6 years after. And some people think, and the dates do check out, I don't think there's any way of proving this, but the dates do check out, that perhaps Queen Victoria, on her visit to Manchester, was given an extra special version of a Manchester pudding. She liked her puddings, that's for sure. And people think perhaps Queen of Puddings was maybe a special version of the Manchester pudding that was approved by Queen Victoria and thereafter became a pudding of its own. Who knows? But what you found was you'd have all these puddings made with very similar ingredients, and you'd look in a book and there would be an excellent pudding, a nice pudding, a very nice pudding, superlative pudding, a very superlative pudding. And it all got very confusing. So people very quickly began to attach names of places and people and things like that so that we could tell the difference. But a lot of these things were just kind of made up because there was also, for the first time from the Victorian period, tourism. So local cafes and things like that would basically make up or cook whatever pudding they know from their repertoire. And suddenly, and a good example of this is Bakewell pudding. They make their pudding that they've been making for ages. Maybe they didn't even come from Bakewell. And no, this is it. This is the traditional Bakewell pudding, and it brings in the tourists. So you've got this great proliferation of names that all appear in the, well, it starts in the Georgian period, but it really explodes in the Victorian. And I just thought, I mean, it gets so eye-crossingly complicated. I thought I'd give you a few more variations on this Manchester pudding to show you what I mean. So there's Chester pudding, which is exactly the same as a Manchester pudding, but there's meringue on top. In fact, you could say it's a cross between the Manchester pudding and Queen of Puddings. Then there's the Chichester pudding, which is the set custard, and then the meringue, but it's just briefly folded in, so you get a sort of stripy two-tone effect. Fine. Deptford pudding, however, is the custard and the meringue, but it's properly folded in and it's quite homogeneous. Staffordshire pudding is a queen of puddings, but with extra rich custard where they've used cream instead of milk and extra egg yolks. Another Chester pudding, puff pastry. The custard is flavored with almonds, no jam, but there is meringue. And my personal favorite for being so overly precise is the Monmouth pudding. Puff pastry case, set custard, but specifically apricot jam. If you've got some other jam in there that's not apricot, that's a Manchester pudding. But if you've got apricot in there, it ceases to be a Manchester pudding and becomes a Monmouth pudding. Completely ridiculous. But what you find is that people get very picky about this. I found this around a very simple pudding called Spotted Dick. I got told by some people that it wasn't a Spotted Dick because I did it in a mold. It's got to be done in a roll, a bit like a jam ravioli. Somebody else told me that a proper Spotted Dick had to be boiled in a cloth, not steamed. So yeah, it gets very confusing. There's differences between regions, there's regional specialities, and yes, you very quickly start to go cross-eyed. But it was good fun researching this bit. I did laugh out loud a few times, and I just kept finding these crazy puddings that had basically no difference between them. But people really fought for them and still fight for them too, despite the fact that they don't really have a proper regionality, and some of them are just being made up for tourist industries, really. Anyway, we're getting towards the end. Pudding future. We historians don't like looking into the future, but one of the things that I found encouraging was since the COVID epidemic, or during the COVID epidemic, the purchase of puddings from supermarkets went up by 20%. And Christmas pudding, which people were thinking was going to go extinct, suddenly became much more popular. It must be that people were wanting comfort food at the time, or food that they had as children. But my question is, were they being made at home? Well, I don't think they were. Well, I'm sure some people were making them at home, but not a significantly large amount. People tended to be buying them. And the one thing that I worry about when it comes to home cooking and making puddings, which I really do believe is some of the most delicious foods that you can get from the United Kingdom, they don't equal good home economics anymore, because you can't boil a pudding for 6 hours. Some of the larger ones take things like 6 hours because fuel is so expensive now. And it used to be, when people had charcoal or coal fires, they would keep it ticking over 24 hours a day. So it made sense to utilize that heat and not waste it. So puddings were perfect for good home economy. It's not the case now, which is a shame because they're so simple to make. However, one of the reasons why puddings are so diverse is because they've always adapted. That's why there's so many different things called a pudding. Puddings change depending on fashions, depending on home economy, what foods are more popular or cheaper, for example. But of course, the puddings aren't evolving. We're evolving and changing. So I think that puddings do have a strong future. We've just got to work out how we're going to do that. So I think it's things that cook for less time, or cook more quickly in the oven, for example. But now, I've not tried this, but apparently pressure cookers are good for making puddings, which of course can reduce your cooking time by 75%. And there's also slow cookers. I've made several puddings in my slow cooker as well. So, there are low energy, low electricity ways of making these puddings. And I don't think puddings are going away. I think that there's just a little bottleneck, but I think we're coming out of it. That's what I reckon. You probably disagree, but of course you can tell me that in the questions, which are about to happen. Just very quickly, if, like I said at the beginning of the talk, I've got my website stroke blog, British Food History, britishfoodhistory.com, with loads of recipes for puddings and more about the history of puddings, as well as the book, of course. And there's my podcast, the British Food History Podcast. If you've not tuned into that, there's several episodes about puddings. There's a Yorkshire pudding one, a Christmas pudding one, and one's coming out hopefully this Friday on the history of puddings. There's A's for Apple, which I co-host with Alessandra Pino and Sam Bilton. Puddings come up quite a lot there. General food history too, of course. And just a reminder, really, these are my various handles if you do want to contact me. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing.